Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. I'm Florence Eshalomi. I'm the chair of the committee. Could our two guests please introduce themselves for the records?
I'm Jim McMahon. I'm the Minister of State covering local government, finance and devolution.
Good morning. My name is Garton. I'm the Director General for Local Government, Growth and Communities at MHCLG.
Thank you. Can my committee members introduce themselves and any additional declarations, please?
I'm Mayor Ellis. I'm the MP for Ribble Valley in Lancashire.
Chris Curtis, Labour MP for Milton Keynes North.
Michelle Khan, the Labour MP for Gillingham and Rainham.
Joe Powell, Labour MP for Kensington and Bayswater.
Lewis Cocking, Broxbourne and Hertfordshire County Councillor.
Jag Mahindra, MP, Conservative MP for South West Hertfordshire.
Good morning, Minister McMahon. Thank you for joining us this morning, and Will. We've just got a few questions to ask you, just in terms of your portfolio and your brief, and we've got a range of different questions from committee members. Minister McMahon, you may be aware that we had the Electoral Commission before us a few weeks ago, and one of the first things that the Chief Exec of the Electoral Commission mentioned was that he would be quite nervous if any elections were delayed beyond a year. And obviously you've got a situation where councils will also be going through their reorganisation at the same time. Are you able to guarantee us, Minister, that no council will be able to delay their elections further than beyond May 2026?
So that is definitely the plan and the direction that has been given by the Deputy Prime Minister. It's important to say, because I know that election postponement, quite rightly, gets a lot of attention. Elections are important, and it's very important that local people have the right to cast their judgment on how local public services are run, and so we didn't take the decision to postpone lightly. And the bar was actually very high. We had a number of applications submitted that we weren't able to approve. And of the 33 elections that were planned to go ahead, the vast majority of those will go ahead, 24 will go ahead. Where we decided that postponement was required, it was very much linked to the Devolution Priority Programme, where we wanted to marshal all that political capital to achieve mayoral elections the year after. And then in addition to that, the Surrey counter.
So in what circumstances would you postpone those elections then?
Well, our assumption is that elections will be taking place as scheduled for the following year. We want to move quickly to the shadow authorities as soon as possible. There are a number of different timetables that will run, the soonest being Surrey, who are on the accelerated timetables to submit their proposals by May. The batch of devolution priority programmes will submit their proposal by September, and then November for the remaining batch who apply as part of the statutory invitation process. Now, it slightly depends on what proposals they submit. If they used district councils and unitary councils as the building blocks, that's a quicker process. They're understood, it doesn't require any kind of complex assessment beyond that. If local areas want to be more nuanced and maybe say that the district council boundaries don't quite reflect the way that the new councils should form for a number of reasons, many of them could be legitimate, that would require longer to work those through. But our working assumption is that elections will take place as planned the following year. And of course, a new batch of mayoral elections on top of that will take place, all being well with the devolution priority programme.
So bearing in mind that you've got authorities going through the reorganisation as well, there'll be staff busy on that. Where do residents fit into this in terms of their voice? Because again, they're the ones that will be casting the ballots.
It's very important. So we, I mean, I've heard a lot of noise around the postponement of elections, that there will not be councillors in place. And the committee will know this, but it's important to say that there will be councillors in place and that the councillors who are in place have been elected. It's just that we have taken the decision to extend their term. And the reason for that partly is about political focus, but it's also about efficiency. That I don't think the public would expect us to support elections to a body that would cease to exist, and the councils that are in scope will cease to exist and be replaced by new councils. And what we want to do is to have elections as soon as is possible to the shadow authorities, so that you get that balance really between elected members who can negotiate and act on behalf of the legacy authorities, but also having shadow elections for the new unitaries, so you have people who are elected to represent the new authorities. And I think that's particularly important when we think about the transfer of assets, the transfer of liabilities, the transfer of workforce, ensuring that there are elected members on both sides that can negotiate on that.
Sort of a very quick question on logistics, which is creating all of these new local authorities is going to involve creating a lot of new ward boundaries very quickly. Yeah. Are we confident that the local government boundary commission, sorry if I've got the name wrong there, has the capacity in order to do all of that work over such short space of time?
I can ask Will to come in on the detailed conversations that have been taking place. We've obviously been in regular contact around this. So if district councils are used as the building blocks or the unitaries within a counter, then it's reasonably straightforward, and the Boundary Commission's responsibility at that point is to draw the ward boundaries then within the councils that are created. And the work programme actually for the devolution priority programme and for Surrey, I would say, is quite modest. What we probably need to bear in mind at this point is that the statutory invitations have gone out and we're waiting for councils to express an interest in there. So at the moment, we don't know how many councils in total will come forward as part of the statutory invitation process beyond the priority programme.
So would that be another area where you'll be aware, Minister, one of the areas I've raised on behalf of councils is that additional funding for some that are taking on the additional reorganisation. Is that another area where you'd consider resources if there's additional work for the local government boundary commission?
So I mean, obviously, any representations that we receive we would be alive to. At the moment, well, I suppose there's two aspects really. One is departmental capacity and making sure that we have the expertise in the department to deploy, and that really was the driving force behind the priority programme. Because what I experienced very early on is there were many conversations about devolution that frankly were going nowhere other than in circles. That was using a lot of departmental time, it was using a lot of local authority time, it was using a lot of political capital actually, as elected members here and in other places wanted to know what on earth was going on. The reason for the priority programme was to marshal all those resources and capacity, so it was really clear on what the government were working to as a priority, what councils needed to marshal at a local level, and there where we had local government reorganisation sat alongside it, we would be clear-eyed on what additional support was going to be required. There is an overlap, and the overlap, of course, is that this year we've done a one-year settlement as part of the local government finance settlement, but we do want to move to a multi-year settlement, and there will be, naturally, a negotiation about how much upfront investment is required to support reorganisation and how much in savings could be taken out at the end of that multi-year settlement as a way of countering some of that.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Minister. Just leaning into what the Chairman said about delaying of elections, even yesterday in conversations I was having with colleagues in this place, there was concerns that local elections could be delayed as far as 2029. Now, if that was the case, that would end up being effectively another term for the sitting councillor without an election. What reassurances can you give us as a committee and the House that if there is any delay beyond elections for 2026, how would you report that back to us in the House so we can communicate to our communities on the need for the delay? Because while I share your ambition to get this done and dusted as quick as possible, there are a lot of communities out there like the Isle of Wight who've had their unitary elections cancelled, and they're scratching their head thinking, what was the necessity for that?
There's a number of questions in there. If we maybe go backwards and Will can come in on the detail of the sequencing, if you like, of how we're going to stack up the elections going forward. The decision on the Isle of Wight is really trying to meet our legal obligation not to predetermine the final arrangements that we would approve. And so once the statutory invitations have gone out, our role obviously becomes one of, in the end, making the final decision on which proposal we want to go forward with, balancing all the different interests that are at play. Now, with the island, of course, a fair assumption would be that a standalone unitary authority covering the island makes sense as it does today. But we can't predetermine what proposals we might get submitted to us and we might have to take into account. So because of that predetermination point, on that particular point, we included it in the wider scope of the county elections being postponed. So that I would come on to Will in terms of the issue of just how far. I mean, I will say, if it's helpful from a political point of view, that the Deputy Prime Minister has been absolutely clear that a postponement of 12 months to allow a process to take place is acceptable. A postponement beyond that wouldn't be. So we need to work through the detail of that if we get proposals that kick it further.
So 2029 is just wrong.
Yeah.
I think we'll be really clear on that. I mean, the only assurance I can give you is the SI that has been laid to postpone the election does so for 12 months. That is clear. So everywhere that is in the devolution priority programme, there are scheduled elections have been moved until May next year. That is the position that has been set out in front of the House. That is absolutely clear. In the devolution priority programme areas, there will also be mayoral elections next year, and we'll look to try and get new shadow unitaries up and running by May 27. But that is the sort of successor organisation, if you like, to the two-tier area. So the delay is for 1 year. That's what's been put forward to Parliament. That is the position of the government, and that is what is going to happen.
Okay.
And just as a follow-up, can you confirm there'll be no other councils that have not already previously been announced that will have a delay in their elections?
Yes.
Well, we wouldn't have to, even if we wanted to, we wouldn't have the time in terms of the SI, but there's no intention at all to postpone any further elections other than those that have been announced. In fact, I think we were very clear that we had a significant number of areas who wanted postponement of elections that we couldn't approve because they didn't meet the threshold that we had set on there. On the point that we haven't answered in terms of reporting to Parliament, we have made a point of trying to be open and transparent. So I think if members track back the number of written ministerial statements that have been tabled, I think they are significant in number, but also in detail, because we want that to be on the record.
On that, Minister, the list was made public on social media before Parliament. You accept that?
On what, sorry?
On the list of councils that had the postponement.
It was, I think it was imperfect but unavoidable. And if I can explain what I mean by that. So obviously we had a commitment to report to Parliament on the list in its entirety. Mm-hmm. But a list couldn't exist without the agreement of the local authorities in question. And so we had to go through a process before we presented to Parliament of having meetings with the individual councils in scope to make sure that they were in agreement to be announced on the list. The minute we spoke to councils, we then had a responsibility to make sure that parliamentarians were informed in their local areas. And so we're trying to sequence one, securing the final agreement of the local authorities before it's presented to Parliament so that the list could hold. What we couldn't afford was to publish a list in good faith, but for council to say, well, hang on, you didn't check back and we've changed our mind since the application was made. But the list in its entirety was only published by the government to Parliament. I think there was a degree of kind of piecemeal reporting that was taking place as individual councils were confirming.
Lewis and then Gagan.
So when are we going to get the next list of the next tranche of councils that are going to go through this project? Obviously, you've done your initial tranche. They're working on their plans. You've written out to everyone else to say we want to hear all of the options you've got. When's the next round likely to be announced of councils that are going to have delayed elections and go through this process? And can you say to that some of those areas will have to have their district council elections delayed if that is a route you want to go down rather than the upper tier authority, because obviously the upper tier authority would have happened by then in those areas that are not on the priority programme. So can you just answer those two questions?
So the dates that we're working to, the statutory invitations went out on the 5th of this month. There'll be a process by which we will fin out the applications that have come, but we're now in a statutory process, so providing for the fact that local authorities make a legitimate request, so there are authorities who can make the request, then at that point we're in a process. I'll ask Will to confirm that date exactly. From that point, areas will be working to a number of different timetables depending on where they are in the process. So we have essentially, I would say, 3 batches. We have the Devolution Priority Programme batch of areas who might be subject to LGR. We then have Surrey, and then we have all others who will submit as part of the priority programme, and they're all working to slightly different timetables. So for those, it will be interim plans for the 21st of March. For Surrey, they'll have final plans, though, by the 9th of May. For the Devolution Priority Programme LGR areas, that'll be the 26th of September. And for the final remaining areas, so those are part of the wider statutory invitation process, that'll be the 28th of November.
But just to make sure I understand your question, if I may, we've written now to all two-tier areas, so everywhere is covered. So there won't be a second batch of invitations to reorganise, if you like, everywhere in England.
That doesn't make sense. So you've done your priority programme, so you wrote out to people and said, do you want to join the priority programme? Lots of people wrote in and you picked 6. So some of those people didn't make it on there. So when everyone submits their next letter that you've written out to, including the ones that didn't make it on the priority programme, surely as a department you are then going to review them and say, well, we're going to do these 5 next.
It doesn't really work like that. Once the statutory invitation goes out, that is the start of the legal process. So when we receive an application in from local authorities, they are in the process. But by there is an inbuilt assumption that once they apply, that they are in reorganisation as part of that process.
So I think I can. So the priority programme is just for mayoral. So the priority programme establishes the areas that want to go forward with a mayor. In parallel to that, we have written to every place. So, I'll give you an example. Hertfordshire didn't apply to be in the priority programme, hasn't decided what it wants, absolutely fine. But we're still writing to 2-tier areas to do local government reorganisation. So the priority programme is only about...
That's not true, is it? The priority programme isn't just about mayoral, because the ones that are in the priority programme are doing local government reorganisation as well. So you can't say the priority programme is just mayoral.
No, the commonality in the priority programme is that they are all working to a mayoral combined authority. That's a commonality.
Whilst doing local government reorganisation.
Some of them will require reorganisation to unlock devolution. Some areas like Surrey can't have devolution because it would create a single local authority, combined authority. So it wouldn't work, and it would be against the direction of travel in the devolution white paper. But that is separate, though, to the wider statutory invitations that are going out, that is dependent on local authorities returning into that process, and then they are in the reorganisation process, and they are in the kind of the timetable, if you like, to submit initial and final proposals to us.
Okay. We're going to move on from this. Thank you. Nashaba, quickly, then we'll move on.
Thank you. It was just on the follow-up to that. So I think just from what Lewis was saying, there is a little bit of, I think there has been a bit of a lack of clarity about how this works in terms of the second stages. As someone who comes from an area that, Medway, which did apply to be on the priority programme and was refused, and is now trying to look at what the next stages of that looks like, I think some type of timetabling and detail about exactly what it means, and I appreciate a letter was written and that provided some level of detail, but I do think, just as Lewis has suggested there, that there is still some confusion about what the next phases look like, and I think local authorities should welcome that, because the big challenge is being able to plan with this, and that's the piece that's missing.
I think there are 2 aspects to that. One is reorganisation. So our hope and expectation is that Kent will be part of the reorganisation programme in this round as part of the statutory invitation process. But that is now separate to the devolution priority programme. So Kent and Medway aren't part of the priority programme, because in the end we had to have a list that was manageable from a capacity point of view, and also where we believe that areas were a state of readiness from local conversations. So there has been a number of meetings taking place with leaders in Kent, actually 2 since the priority programme was announced. And there is definitely a commitment from the government and from local leaders to find a way of delivering devolution. But at the moment, there isn't a landing slot, if you like, for them to go into, because we're focusing on the devolution priority programme. Now, it may well be that the priority programme goes well, that all those that are on the list carry on as normal, and actually things go quite smoothly, because we have been able to marshal it, and areas we're at a high state of readiness. And that may well be that we're at a state to receive a further round earlier in terms of devolution, but we do need to see how it goes from that point of view.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. And I know that, again, there will be some things out of your control, Minister, but and we do thank you for the letters that you sent, but if you could keep us updated as a committee, that would be helpful on any changes, any slippage, the same way you keep the House updated. Maya.
Thank you. So while all the plumbing that we've been discussing is really important, just moving on to some questions now about how we actually make the most of the opportunity of strategic authorities going forward. Some of the witnesses we've heard from on the subjects have raised concerns about sort of the lack of agility and flexibility in the funding that is made available, particularly to newer combined authorities, and given that strategic authorities, and given that we are going to have many more of those, Can you just talk a little bit about the decision around sort of the 10% limitation on funds, particularly for things like adult skills? Because I think certainly the Mayor of West Yorkshire we heard from said, you know, that sort of 18-month limit to sort of unlock further funding is problematic and feels a bit arbitrary. I believe you're having conversations. Could you maybe up-to-date us on where your thinking is around that and how we can unlock those opportunities for flexibility and agility for newer combined authorities?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things in there. One is, and we have heard it from a number of areas, I suppose a slight impatience on the 18 months. So this is a requirement that in order to receive the integrated settlement, areas have to have been in existence for 18 months. They can't have had intervention of any kind or concerns in terms of kind of financial probity, etc. And areas are saying, well, hang on, we've been able to develop much sooner and we could do it today. For some of them, they might have had a combined authority type arrangement before a mayor came into existence, for instance. But I think it is important, and the white paper does go into this quite heavily, to accept that in a way, because devolution has been done in quite an organic way, it's built over time. It's my belief that the checks and balances and the architecture around it isn't sufficiently robust enough to have kind of large-scale devolution. And the reason why we've gone so strongly in the white paper is because we want a genuine transfer of power, resource and decision-making from this place to local communities. Well, that's only as strong as, one, the financial resilience of the local authorities that are there to support devolution, and that's a big piece of work in terms of financial resilience and the fit, legal and decent of local government. But also that actually combined authorities and mayoral combined authorities, as they become strategic authorities, when the legislation comes in, have the right checks and balances and the architecture around them to support that. And I think it is right, and I don't think it's an unreasonable expectation from HMT to say that with further devolution and further freedoms when it comes to financial freedoms, that the checks and balances do need to be in place and there does need to be a criteria for that. So I actually think it's in the right place, to be honest, and there'll always be a trade-off between that the central government want to direct because it wants to make sure that everywhere in the country gets access to the same level of opportunity, but accepting the best way to achieve the outcomes that we all want is to allow that local flexibility that is able to marshal it to the local place.
Thank you. Chris?
Thanks. Currently the West Midlands, Greater Manchester and Glasgow have innovation funds. Would you consider rolling out innovation funds to mayoral strategic authorities?
I'd like Will come in on the detail of the growth fund and innovation funds.
Yes, it's a commitment in the white paper. I think we should be clear, though, that obviously innovation funds aren't currently in the integrated settlement. I think we've made tremendous progress with the integrated settlement. It is 20 different funding streams that were sort of with a variety of conditions and hoops that places had to jump through, and now suddenly from April this year Greater Manchester have got £629 million as a sort of block capital settlement. I know that they want more flexibility than the 10% that you raised, but I think that's something we could come back to and would look to review it at the end of this spending review period. I'd be surprised, by the way, if they did do more than 10% flexibility to start off with, but that's definitely something to come back to. Currently, we haven't got innovation funds there. Those are run by UKRI. You're absolutely right to identify the innovation accelerators in those three places as a potential model. We're looking at it quite hard. The trade-off is local flexibility against sort of an excellence criteria from UKRI, but we've got commitment to look at it properly, and I think it's something we should come back to as we roll out the integrated settlement.
I think, I mean, there's a large number of kind of government arm's length bodies that put funding in place for different areas of the country. Do you see the direction of travel being, take Homes England for example, do you see the direction of travel being that those organisations are all, that's devolved down and combined authorities are taking on the power to dish out Homes England funding or Arts Council funding?
Yeah. The commitment in the white paper is to move Homes England to a regionalised model, which is quite a big change. We want it to be more place sensitive, less place agnostic. We want it to be embedded in the strategies and the local growth plans and the planning powers that combined authority, the strategic authorities have. We've also got commitment in the white paper too, because we know that there are frustrations with engagement with Highways England and Network Rail, and we understand that. Now, those organisations have also got immensely complicated programmes to roll out, but I think we can do better on making them sensitive to place and part of the overall local plan, and that is something we're looking at. It's not obvious how you structure it, so it does take a bit of work, but that is certainly on our to-do list, yeah.
And just on that, just on the sort of direction of travel as well, there's obviously across lots of areas, lots of public sector-owned buildings that are owned often by an eclectic mix of national organisations here. NHS Property Services, I think, is one that we've been talking about recently. Do you see a kind of move, again, direction of travel, appreciating the difficulties, to having a kind of one public estate model that's moving under the control of combined authorities?
Well, I mean, that is a piece of work. We had a webinar yesterday, actually, with the LGA and Georgia Gould from the Cabinet Office, where we were talking about public sector reform and the one public estate approach for that. So I think it's got to happen. I think partly because if we want to improve public services in a way that people can see, feel and value, and I think in many areas the last decade has really taken its toll on decent public services and local public assets, then we've got to sweat the assets that we do have better than we currently do. And it's fair to say in the areas where we need, I would say, most intervention, so those with high levels of deprivation, high levels of need, I would say they were probably the first in line when asset disposals came, and I think the assessment that I saw was something like 75,000 public assets have been sold in the last decade. If you were to map where those are, I would say they're in the areas of need where we need intervention. So we do need to use the public estate better, and that's better for house building, to free up that public estate for development, but it's also just better in terms of kind of sweating the assets so the public get a better return on that investment. So it is a work stream that's taking place in its infancy, it'd be fair to say, but it has only been, 7 or 8 months. So.
Yeah, that's good. Right. Chris.
Right, just final question from me. I mean, it's great to sit. I'm passionate about the policy. I think it's great to see the direction of travel on this. And I think you've talked about lots of work streams that are moving very fast. We hope to be sort of getting going quite quickly with. I think there is a concern, at least I certainly have a concern, that while we're doing this, you could end up with a real two-tier problem. You've got places where have got combined authorities that have been put in place. You've got lots of areas of the country that won't have combined authorities, in many cases won't have for some time. In my case, we've got a place that's desperate for a combined authority and wasn't fast-tracked. Are you confident that those places without combined authorities are not going to be missing out on opportunities from this government, whether that's potential funding pots, opportunities, the ability to do some of the things that we've been talking about? How are you going to ensure that they don't get left behind as you move towards giving all of these opportunities to places with combined authorities?
I mean, for me, that is tied very strongly into the local government finance settlement and the multi-year settlement and the review that we're taking, that we're consulting on at the moment in terms of relative needs and resources, where we are determined to move away from the competitive bidding process of the previous government, where areas were set up against each other to bid for a very limited supply of resource, to a model where there is a fair assessment of need, fair assessment of deprivation, fair assessment of the cost of service drivers, and that areas get a fair amount to deliver decent public services and investment in their local area. So on that model, recognising that local authorities are the foundation of devolution, we expect at the end of the multi-year settlement that areas will be in a good position, or certainly a much better position than they are today. But it would be disingenuous not to say there will be a difference in areas that have a mayoral combined authority as we move to strategic authorities, because the level of ambition in terms of what will be devolved is growing. And so we should be honest about that. Now, what we want to do is to ensure that every part of England benefits from devolution, and in particular benefits from mayoral devolution and strategic authorities. Why? Because that massively takes away the kind of the role of central government to command and control and determine what gets done in each local area, and gives that power to local areas. But it also means that everywhere has their champion that can pull together different parts of investment, whether that's public sector investment, private sector investment, and also I bring into account at this point the review that we're taking place for the local government pension scheme, where there is a huge resource there that, if better marshalled, could be used to invest in UK PLC, if you like, investable products that will benefit local communities. So kind of blending all that together at a local level with a champion of a mayor supported by local leaders is the direction of travel. And for those areas that have that, our expectation is that they will feel the difference. Otherwise, what's the point in devolution?
My question is kind of
and then Joe.
My question is kind of building on that. Is how do you marry up, or where's your current thinking in taking innovation funding, for example? Is that I think there's lots of people who would argue that historically, in the last 10 years, a lot of the innovation funding has gone directly to the combined authorities because it's a bit of a shortcut and an easy route. And I get that there's an argument to say actually that's a valid shortcut because those areas are organised, they're ambitious, they've got the infrastructure to potentially deliver that. But once you have more combined authorities, there's only a limited pot of, for example, innovation funding or Arts Council funding. How do you marry up that the national assessment of need in different areas versus the idea that actually every area is entitled to their bit of devolved money? So, like I said, take innovation, for example, it's a fair argument to say that not every area in the country, even when every area is devolved, it would be a fair national assumption to say actually not every area is going to have the critical impact for the innovation funding. So how are you then going to marry up that decision of, if you're not going to devolve it equally, how do you marry that up with need?
I mean, that's a very fair point. Part of the reason why we're determined to see every mayoral strategic authority with a local growth plan is so that there is an anchor document, if you like, there's an underpinning that makes it the sum of its parts. And I think many local authorities have tried their best, whether it was through UKSPF or innovation funds or different kind of routes, whether it's a high streets fund or left behind towns fund with local authorities working in partnership to navigate what is a complex picture. A good outcome is that the majority of funds that are currently in scope are devolved down, and that's part of a single allocation that is made. But we have to be realistic and say that any central government will want to be able to say that there are certain national priorities that we want to see accelerated, we want to make funding available for that, and there will be an assessment about how that's
then how do you make sure
delivered.
That you don't fall back into grant funding, that those local growth funds plans don't just become another essentially application into a national pot for innovation funding, for example, that people have to bid on based on how good their local growth plan is?
Well, with the local growth plans and the integrated settlements wouldn't be like a competitive bidding process, but there is always a process by which we have to cut the cloth to suit. So if there's a national allocation of any money, we do this in local government finance settlement as much as we do with capital or any other type of funding. There would always be those conversations about how best to direct resources. I think there is, though, and we do talk about this in the consultation that's out about the multi-year settlement and the future review of local government spending, which is in large part for day-to-day spending. It's not for the government to give everyone exactly the same within local government. It's for local government to take a fair assessment of what areas can legitimately and fairly raise from local taxation, whether that's council tax and business rates, and for the central government to be an equaliser to the system to make sure that no area is left behind just because it has an historic tax base that is weaker than others, higher levels of demand on the other side, that means that the sums just don't add up. It's for central government to make sure that every community have access to decent public services and that we are providing an equalisation to the system. And that's a slightly different point. But I would say that many combined authorities have been forced to almost infill because of local authorities retreating in some areas because they just haven't had the capacity and the resource to deliver decent public services.
Okay, thank you. Joe.
Just go back to Chris's, follow up on Chris's point about, so obviously for London we have the GLA Act from 1999, and I understand, the focus has been on filling in the map, but it does start to feel like the London deal looks less ambitious than a lot of the more recent deals. So when will we have a proper look at the right balance between the boroughs, the mayor and central government in terms of London?
Well, I mean, the honest answer is that these are live conversations. One, because there's plenty of people who want to have conversations about it, and we want to be open to that. But also, I think it is legitimate for councils in London to look at councils outside of London and say that the mayoral combined authority model as it is today, moving to strategic authorities, does give local authorities outside of London a seat around the table and a different role than local authorities in London. And I think where that comes into focus is really accepting the principle that growth and reform are two sides of the same coin, that if you want to see economic growth in a way that is felt in every community, you've got to reform public services as a foundational means to achieve that. Well, that's councils. And London councils will say quite rightly that we want to have a relationship with government that is a direct relationship that, of course, is complementary to the role of the GLA and the mayor, but is particularly given that we are the service deliverer in large part for the government programmes that are in scope. Now, that's not to say that there is an answer. It's not even to say that there's a proposal, but it's to say that these are live conversations that we're aware of and we do understand the tensions.
That's good. Obviously, I should declare an interest, having been a council assembly member, now an MP, and that would be good to see those discussions with London, with my London hat on.
Well, we were clear in the white paper, and there's a section on London, because I think there's a slight danger in England because we are such a centralised country that if you're not in London, you look to London and everything is a London style. We want a London style housing scheme, we want a London style transport scheme, and actually I think we need to kind of raise our heads a bit further up and say that isn't the measure here. We need to be looking at European counterparts, we need to be looking at the American cities and other places, and say that devolution is not a job done in London, actually far from it. But equally to say that because innovation has been taking place in other parts of England, there are some places that are just more advanced when it comes to devolution than London itself. And so having that kind of almost kind of step back and assessment, I think now is the right time to do it.
Thank you. Moving on to mayoral and council accountability, Joe.
Yeah, so some of our witnesses throughout this inquiry have talked about the concerns around scrutiny, so it kind of builds a little bit on what we we're just talking about with the consensus-based model for mayoral combined authorities. What steps are you planning to take to strengthen scrutiny? What's your kind of vision for what good scrutiny will look like?
I think combined authorities have done a good job at trying to, by and large, self-organise different scrutiny models in a way that brings members in from the component local authorities to provide some degree of check and balance. But I would say as combined authorities have grown and developed and as they've received more delegation, more authority individually, it is the right moment through the white paper as we prepare the legislation to think about how we can strengthen that. So we are looking at things like accountable officers, so you have that very clear political official divide. We are consulting and we are open to hearing ideas on local public accounts committees where that check and balance can exist. We are alive to the tension around mayoral development corporations and those currently being out of scope of best value and whether they should be brought into the scope of best value so the oversight can be in place, and a range of other measures. So those were in the white paper. We're currently assessing kind of sector representations at the moment, and we are preparing the ground for the legislation.
And just in terms of sort of between election citizen engagement, obviously as you get to a bigger kind of unit, one of the concerns is it becomes harder to have some of that direct citizen engagement. Are you thinking about ways of encouraging kind of public participation in policy development, kind of citizen oversight between elections? So I'll probably kind of come at that from two aspects really. One is to what extent are people involved early enough in the formulation of decisions rather than at the back end when the really decision has been made and you out to a consultation as a way of a check and balance. I think versus the power that people want to feel in the places where they live, so that they're positive about the direction of travel in their immediate community. And I think those are related, but they can be quite separate. One thing a number of things that we covered in the white paper was actually the role of what we currently might say are backbench councillors. I think it's quite offensive to many councillors who would say we're the front line, we are the people on the ground, knocking the doors, doing the work, raising the issues. And actually, if we had a bit more power and agency, we could get a lot more done. We're very clear in the white paper that we want to recast those backbench councillors as frontline community conveners with more power in the places where they live so that they can get things done. And I think for most members of the public, that would be significant progress on where they are now, where actually very minor things that get reported can kind of churn around the organisation for months or years in some cases before even being resolved. So that's one bit, and that's in the white paper, because we don't believe that the project, if you like, is just transferring power from here to mayors. That's not it at all. The real test is, do people feel more power and agency in the places where they live and able to get things done and feel confident about the future than they did before?
And so you've got to have a top-to-bottom distribution of power on that basis. I mean, that's quite separate, though, to the check and balance that we're trying to build in terms of the rigour of combined authority decision-making, the checks and balances, the skills around the table, and also whether or not trading companies should be in scope of best value or not.
Final question is just in terms of that second part, do you think there is a case for professionalised staff to support scrutiny committees? So like we would have in this, like a select committee here, but having dedicated staff capacity and training to do that?
I mean, and that would be entirely in line with the way that local government works. You know, local government can have independent members. Some of them will have independent chairs. They will be drawn from a range of professionalisms, including accountancy backgrounds, and having the same support in strategic authorities as it will be is definitely something that we want to see grown out.
Thank you. Moving on to where's the money? Fiscal devolution. Michelle.
Thank you, Chair, and I appreciate that we've touched on this already, but it would just be helpful to understand, given the opportunities that we've had with this particular white paper, why further fiscal devolution and powers to combined authorities hasn't been part of it.
I think in the way, because we are so underdeveloped from kind of the freedoms and flexibilities even within the current system, I would say there has been a priority about unlocking the current system, and to do that both for local government in terms of the number of individual grant schemes with individual reporting requirements, individual terms and conditions given by different parts of government, do add to actually a very complicated landscape, but probably more than that, add to a culture of waiting to be told what to do and how to do it. And so there is a review taking place now as part of the local government finance settlement work to take away ring fences, to look at the consolidation of different grant funds. And we did begin that work as part of this settlement. In a way, the integrated settlements are the same, but for combined authorities at a bigger scale across more ranges of government activity. And that was the focus, because we haven't made the progress in the last decade that I think we probably could and should have done. But not to duck the question about fiscal devolution, I do think there is a tension on wanting to have an overview of the impact of tax decisions across the piece. And I think that's particularly relevant when it comes to business taxation and making sure that the burden of business taxation is seen in the round and not kind of segregated off. And I think also we need to develop our proposal on that. So the type of taxes that have been proposed will not be a surprise to the committee. We get routine requests for things like tourism tax, overnight accommodation levies from mayors, and those are fairly regular conversations. But I think there is still a case to be made for it.
And just to touch upon that then, obviously compared to perhaps, some of our European counterparts and so in the way that we have fiscal devolution, it is quite constrained by comparison, which does mean that there are challenges, particularly for local government, and that's something that we've at this committee have heard from other witnesses in the past. I know you've just touched there upon some certain taxations that could be used, and for example, we did hear quite powerfully about the visitor levy which is used in Edinburgh and how that could be, what that can generate for a city and how that could be expanded. I appreciate that's not the only answer and that's not going to work for everyone, but what work is being done to sort of understand some of the best practice that is being done by some of our local authorities, taking into account what you've said that we are quite far, in terms of those proper devolutionary powers around fiscal devolution is still a bit of a challenge, but there is still some examples of good practice, and I just wanted to understand how you're using some of those and how that's being considered as part of this process.
Well, I mean, I think that's happening now. Manchester has a voluntary overnight accommodation levy in place for the hoteliers in Manchester City, and of course, learning will be taken from that. I think where there are conversations about fiscal devolution, and if you like, I would say kind of marginal taxes. I only say that in the round that they might generate a reasonable sum, but in the scheme of freedoms in, say, the integrated settlement, you are talking about budget lines in the end that will end up being in the billions, not just the tens of millions or hundreds of millions even. So the scale of ambition is beyond just that local authorities can take. I think it's also maybe just slightly being more realistic about how far any government might want to go for that, because any government will naturally be mindful of the burden of tax on individuals and on business. The level of or the schedule of tax at a local level, by and large, is ring-fenced to council tax and business rates at a local level. But we all know around the table that those are two forms of taxes that are acutely felt. Council tax by individuals and households, and businesses by the high street and businesses that are operating in still quite a challenging environment. So, any government will have a view on that and will want to take that in the round. As a country, we're certainly not there in terms of kind of radical devolution in the way that I know some political parties might say in terms of kind of local income tax levels and the rest of it. If you look at kind of maybe European counterparts, and that's probably where it would take you to. That isn't a piece of work that we're looking at in terms of local income tax type, kind of fiscal devolution of scale on that.
Do you think that would be the next round of areas that you'd want to explore? Because you've cited our European counterparts, so in comparison, councils only collect about 5%, in France it's 14%, 23%, in Japan 35%, in Sweden relatively smaller population size to us. Do you think we can get to bigger percentages, and this is something that could help councils in the future?
Well, I mean, if we take the view that devolution is an evolution rather than a revolution, although some of the parliamentary conversations definitely feel like it's a revolution at the moment, then that might be something for the future. But I'll say honestly that there isn't a piece of work taking place on fiscal devolution that take you anywhere near the type of percentages that you talk about. I think England, for historic reasons, is fairly unique, and there isn't a piece of work that's going to reset that today. What we can do, though, is to give local areas more control over the public money that is being spent in their area today, but actually is very constrained. And all the conversations that we're having with local leaders and with mayors is about giving them the freedom to make the right choice for their areas rather than being constrained by central government, which is where the integrated settlements come into it. And of course, we've got the two in Greater Manchester and West Midlands coming out at the moment. The following year, we've got 4 others. We've got a set criteria now, so local authorities and combined authorities know how they can work towards it. And I think that is good progress.
I think it's been probably said there, but just I appreciate what the Minister said. I just wanted to understand a little bit. We might not want to get to the levels that we see in our European counterparts where that piece of work's not being looked at. Mm-hmm. But are there any plans to look at further tax evolving powers at this point, in the near future? Is there any flexibility in this, or anything beyond just simply council tax and business rates that are being considered?
I mean, I wouldn't rule anything out, but I would say in terms of the focus of the current project, it is about rolling out the integrated settlements. It's about more freedoms and flexibilities at a local level. And in direct answer, is there a significant piece of work on kind of radical fiscal devolution? There is not. That isn't to say, though, that we are closed to proposals. And if a case can be made from local government or from mayors, then we'll be open to that. I can ask Will to come in on kind of more detail about any other aspects, but I wouldn't want to kind of set the committee off on a false route about the scale of that.
I'm sure you'll be looking at the levy that they're introducing in Edinburgh when that starts. Is that something that maybe you'd be able to come back to us later once you've seen that proposal?
Well, I mean, I've been very honest and said that, look, we are alive to, these are fairly now routine requests that come in from our mayors and from local authorities about what I would say are quite marginal freedoms around fiscal devolution, but also to return to say that any government will want to take taxation in the round. And that's the position.
Thank you. Maya.
Looking broadly at this country at the moment, we know that political engagement and democratic engagement is quite low. But hopefully, the aims of unitarisation devolution should be aiming to re-engage people more with government, to have more faith in what it can do and to improve it. So just to ask a few questions around unitarisation particularly, in my constituency, Ribble Valley, we've got big rural areas where, again, that political engagement, that sense that government, local and national, works for rural areas and regional areas is low. So what are your, how are you ensuring that rural areas and places in regions and people on the ground feel engaged with this process, and how are you kind of holding local areas to account that they make sure that they do that through this process of particularly of unitarisation and reorganisation?
Well, I mean, I think it goes it predates reorganisation in the current round, to say that I think one of the very first things that was sacrificed at the start of austerity was local neighbourhood services. And I think because quite a lot of council delegation to things like district executives or area committees or district forums or neighbourhood forums were by and large for neighbourhood type services. I think a lot of district working was sacrificed as a result of that. And I think even where it currently exists, it's probably a shadow in many places of what it was. And I do think that there is something that brings kind of back a decent level of neighbourhood services at a point in time when we rebuild, and we're at that point, with local leaders, so ward councillors being able to convene the local community to agree a set of local priorities that people believe are right for their area. That is where we would want to get to. But I'll be honest and say it's going to take time to rebuild. I think many local authorities, I think, are probably thankful for the finance settlement that they've had. And we did a lot to marshal to get the money to where it was needed. And I think the fact that we haven't, I mean, touch wood, we haven't had any Section 114s as a result of financial distress is a testament to the work that we've done in terms of the recovery grant and other measures. But we're under no illusions about the pressures that councils are facing. And when faced still with a choice between adult social care, children's services, temporary accommodation, and those statutory dominating pressures, councils in many places haven't yet got the headroom. But this project is not a single-year project. This is about, over the life of the Parliament, rebuilding local government so it's fit, legal and decent. It has strong foundations that we can build back up from. And I think if we do that, we do begin to address the local disconnect where people don't think the council is working in their interest. And I say that predates reorganisation, because even in areas with district councils, if they don't think that their local services are being provided to a standard, their local area isn't being championed, frankly, the council could be 100 miles away. The disconnect is powerful. And so we've got to rebuild that localism theme as much as devolution.
Is there anything that you are trying to bed in, though, to the process over the next year where the decisions are being made about how areas reorganise, where you do expect local councils to engage locally? Or is it in your judgment that actually that's for the councillors to decide?
It's probably a bit of both. So the criteria that we set out, of course, it has population numbers, because in part this is about efficiency and it's about taking money that's currently held in operational costs down to the front lines that people can see an improvement in services. But the councils will have to take into account local identity and have the councils in the end that do make sense in the way that people can relate. But whatever size of council comes through reorganisation, in the end, it matters to those councils and to councils that aren't part of reorganisation, that at the end of this project, people in every part of England should feel that they have more responsive, better provided local public services, and that local councillors, because we do have a deficit here where councillors maybe don't want to come forward for a number of reasons, but part of that is because they don't think they can get things done. They don't think they can make the change. I mean, how many councillors stand for one term and don't re-stand because they think, well, what's the point in that? That's because I wanted to make a difference and I wasn't able to do it. Now that would matter for a council that isn't yet in reorganisation of 100,000 or 200,000 to a much larger council. It shouldn't matter, providing that they've got a localism agenda and that they've got a way of working to local communities.
If I could just specifically reassure you on the criteria that we set out for local government reorganisation, one of the things that we've said we want to see, and I quote, is new unitary structures enabling stronger community engagement, delivering opportunity for neighbourhood empowerment. So we're very conscious of the risk that you might lose some of that, and we don't want that to happen, and we've been really explicit that that's one of our criteria going forward.
Just very quickly, one of the things that it would feel to me would help square this circle is, while you're moving powers from districts up to these slightly larger unitary authorities, you also looked at powers that would be potentially moving down from those district councils, got those parish councils in place. I think parish councils are mentioned 3 times in the white paper. Is there a stream of work at looking at how actually you can solve some of these localism problems by looking at, more support and more powers that can be moving down to parishes?
I think so. I mean, we did include in the English Devolution white paper a section on community power. So there is quite a lot of this that is kind of architectural. It is about the structures that support devolution and local government. But that is quite separate to the powers that people feel in the places where they live, and that can range from whether they can affect a local decision or feel positive about local investment, right to whether they feel they've got any control at all over the decline of the local high street or the loss of local community assets. And so the agenda on that is quite wide, and it's in development. And we do reference community and town, parish and town councils, partly because there are over 10,000 of them. So they have to be part of the family and part of the answer. But we were also very clear not to skip over the role of local government, because I think the danger in the devolution conversations has been, honestly, it can be a bit too much about combined authorities and mayors, and probably not as much about local authorities. And local authorities are the foundation of combined authorities. They are the foundation of devolution, and they have to have a clearly defined role, and they have to be empowered far more than they are today in the new settlement. But that's not at the expense of more local structures. When it comes to town and parish councils, they will have a role too.
More specific. So just going back to unitarisation, how you make decisions locally, and this I'll be putting you on the spot, so if you can't answer now, just appreciate a response on this in writing if we can get it. It's just where councils in a local area can't come to a single consensus in terms of a proposal for reorganisation or unitaries, what criteria are the government going to use to choose which proposal to adopt?
We set out the criteria in the letter that went out as part of the statutory invitation. We've also had some feedback from local authorities that said if there was a template, a pro forma, that not to limit local proposals, but to kind of to form the submission to the statutory invitation, that would be helpful too. The government will naturally, as the decision maker, have to reserve its position to say if there are competing proposals that do come forward. In some areas that is inevitable. It's fairly obvious that in some areas that there will not be a consensus amongst local authorities. Then we'll have to get the balance between scale and efficiency, local identity, and in the end unitary councils that have an anchor to them that make sense.
Those, you'd say those are three criteria effectively?
The criteria is wider than that, but as a guiding criteria from a political point of view.
Yeah, so it's reform, having a single council, the right size that they can withstand shocks and achieve efficiency, so the guidance on 500,000, the delivery of high quality public services, how that they've worked together with colleagues in the place, supporting devolution arrangements and community engagement.
And so essentially there's competing priorities, you will judge each of those criteria based on how well they meet them.
And those criteria are all published and clear, and ultimately, as the Minister says, then there is a judgment for the Minister and the Secretary of State to make.
It also requires flexibility, I think, on all sides, because we're very keen to reset the relationship between central government and local government, where I felt for a long time local government felt it was being done to. Now, I know in reorganisation, when we're very clear about the direction of travel, that we are looking to bring to an end the two-tier system and to reorganise for the remaining 21 counties. That is a clear direction of travel. We're also very clear on the direction of travel in terms of mayoral strategic authorities completing the map of England. But how we do it can be done in partnership. And I would say for those that submitted in the priority programme, those were all self-selected areas that came forward, and actually there was more interest in that process than we were able to accommodate. But it requires flex on both sides. An example of that would be, if you were just focusing on efficiency, you would have reorganisation that delivered a fairly uniform set of local authorities of about 500,000 population each. But we do understand that in some places, that in order to achieve other competing interests like identity and belonging, and in some places just very vast geography, that flexibility is required on population size. And we've said that we're willing to be open to that, and we look forward to proposals coming forward.
Thank you. We're just moving on to that, the same with population. Yes. Lewis.
So I want to talk about how we got to the 500,000 figure. So obviously, when you were coming up with this proposal within the department, was that £500,000 population in there from the start, or did the department have a different figure in there? It got to the Treasury, and the Treasury were like, "No, you're not having that. We're changing it."
There wasn't a different figure. The 500,000, I think, is generally accepted of if you want to do reorganisation for efficiency, but you want councils that are that kind of get the balance between local identity, the spread of geography, bearing in mind the two-tier, but the two-tier system is generally across the shire counties. Then that gives you that figure that is a compromise, I suppose, between efficiency and geography. But from that number, we have reflected that in some places they would not be able to reach the 500,000 population mark and maintain the other criteria around local identity and having an anchor to the local authority that makes sense to the local community. And so the 500,000 is a guide, and I think that's correct to provide that because local government was asking for that, but also to say that we do accept there'll need to be flexibility in proposals that come forward.
Sorry, so just to clarify, Minister, on that, there was no evidential basis for that 500,000 figure?
Well, the evidence is really on local government reorganisation that has taken place, and what we've seen from local government reorganisation that have taken place, and there are different variations on a theme, some much larger, some much smaller, is that is the right level to get efficiencies out of the system, given that it's an efficient to drive and there's money held up in the two-tier system that can be redirected to frontline services that people see and feel. But recognising that in large parts these cover quite large geographies.
I would just add, so, as it says in the white paper, 500,000 is the minimum. I mean, ultimately, it is a judgment. I'm not going to pretend that because it would be misleading to say there's some formula or evidence base that can spit out that 500 is okay, but 480 is not, or, you know, there is an element of judgment in this. There's not a sort of, you can't say definitively it's the right answer because so many other factors are in play, not least identity, alignment of public service boundaries, travel to work areas, and so on and so forth. So it's a judgment. It's a judgment that we've come to. Reasonable people could take a slightly different take, but ultimately we've had to make that judgment and give that as the minimum.
So what's the lower limit then? So if you're saying, well, if you meet all of the other criteria, but you don't meet this criteria, you must have in your head, well, we'll accept 200,000, we'll accept 300,000. What's that? What's the lower figure then?
Well, I mean, at the moment, the statutory invitation has gone out, so it's the local areas to decide whether they want to be part of this batch of LGRs that are going forward, and it's for local areas to develop their proposal. We've issued the framework, if you like, for that. What does a good outcome look like? Well, everyone agrees in their locality on what they want, so there's only a single proposal that comes forward. It gets exactly the right balance between efficiencies, and that might take you up to 500,000, but local identity, so everyone says, and this completely works for our area. But of course, the real world says, in some places that might happen, but in other places that will be more challenging. And so the government have to be flexible, but it's not for... I don't think at this point it's helpful to add more confusion to a process when we've already set the criteria.
You're already adding confusion, aren't you? So you've
allowing flexibility that say we will do this in partnership, I would reject as adding confusion. That is about working in partnership and being flexible, and that's what we've been asked for. But setting a clear sense of direction, which is what the criteria is also what's been asked for. And I think we've done the two for the right reasons.
The white paper says the minimum is 500k. So
that's not what the minister did.
No, he did. He said there will be some exceptions to that, but as a guiding principle, we have 500,000 or more is what the this document says.
And the white paper is very clear that what do we mean by exceptions? That where it's going hand in hand with devolution, where strategic authorities are being created at a larger population base and a larger geography, that you might want to give a bit on population to have a more localised footprint. So it's hand in hand with devolution on that.
So what's going to happen to all of the other unitaries that are currently existing? So like your own council, Oldham, 242,000. What's going to happen to them? So you're saying that's a bad council, it's not efficient, that needs to be abolished or merged with something else to get it to 500,000 people?
Well, at that point, it's not really about population size, it's about the two-tier system where councillors, I mean, just think about how many councillors are dual-hatted because they represent both the district council and the county council, because to get things done, they feel like they have to be in both places in some cases. But also from the taxpaying member of the public who don't know which local authority to go to get a very basic service carried out. So some of it is just about that simplicity in the system, which obviously in Oldham, where it's a single local authority, we don't have that issue at all.
So why are you picking on size then in terms of population? That makes no sense. So if you want local councils to be efficient, and you're saying you have to have 500,000 people to be efficient, to be effective and all of the rest of it, why are you not answering the question in terms of what are you going to do with existing small unitaries that do not meet that criteria?
There's not a proposal to carry out reorganisation in the Met authorities to answer directly the point being made. So I think that's a bit of a distraction. The project is across the remaining 21 two-tier areas to bring to an end the two-tier system, to create unitary authorities in those areas, and then in achieving that, giving a clear enough steer to local areas to develop localised proposals to submit to government that we can assess, which is what we've done.
So do you think your local council is a good local authority?
Well, that's in the eye of the beholder. Obviously, I think my council's
And
wonderful.
the reason why I ask that is, why can't you allow other proposals then to come forward of the similar population to your own council?
Because this is about balancing clarity for the taxpaying public, efficiency of delivering local public services and getting money to the front line rather than operational costs. But efficiency also brings you to scale. And so there is always a tension between, in two-tier areas, those people-targeted services like adult social care and children's services that are provided currently by the counter being divided into unitary authorities. The more that you divide them into more local authorities, the more upward pressure that you're putting on that capacitor. So there's always going to be a balance and a compromise that needs to be made on that. But it wouldn't be our expectation that local authorities will be marshalling for population sizes of the mid-200s. Those aren't representations that we've had so far from any area, actually.
But you do accept that for some of the smaller unitaries, they're hovering on 219, Plymouth, Stoke-on-Trent 263, Peterborough 219, Leicester 380. You accept that, and you accept that this, if we're going to be honest, this arbitrary figure of 500,000 is what you're asking them to work on.
To a point, any figure that we publish will be arbitrary, but it's about giving a framework. So when areas are pulling together to try and reach the local consensus where possible, they know broadly the guidelines that they're working to in making the submissions. And you have to draw the line somewhere, and we believed that was the right compromise between scale and efficiency and having a local anchor that makes sense in most places. Of the areas that have been mentioned, I would say a lot of them will say that they feel actually quite constrained, that they have housing demand, they have economic demand that goes far beyond their own local authority boundaries, further into surrounding districts. And actually they would say that their natural functioning area isn't reflected at all in their local government boundaries as it stands today.
Chris?
Just picking up on the Chair's previous comments, I think the broad question was, we are not aware of any evidential basis for the number. And the response was, to paraphrase slightly, well, look, it's always going to have some level of subjectiveness to it, which I accept. But both of those two things can be true at the same time, and yet we still haven't seen the evidence for where you made the evidence that went behind where those subjective decisions came from. So, you know, and it could be that some would be pointing slightly higher than 500,000 and some of the indicators would be pointing slightly lower than 500,000. But we haven't seen anything or any evidential basis behind that decision at all. So I think it would be good to see, whilst appreciating the subjectiveness about it, would be good to see some of the reasons, some of the evidential basis that the department made when coming up with that decision, so we can have some level of confidence in the number, that it was right given the trade-offs involved.
I think we can. I mean, there are assessments made of the savings that can be achieved through local reorganisation, and there have been very recent reorganisations that have taken place that have delivered savings. And so I think that evidence is there. What makes it difficult about profiling potential savings going forward is that we don't know yet what proposals local areas are going to submit to government for us to agree to, and that will be a significant determiner on the amount of savings that can be drawn out.
I get the point on the savings generally, but you could have gone. We get the point about unitarisation. We don't need to have a number. You decided to put the number in there because you've looked at some evidence, I assume, that points to that number being the right one. I think it would be good for us to know what that evidence is.
I don't think there's any evidence. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, we can provide the references for the assessments that are out there, and we can provide examples of reorganisation that has taken place and the savings that have been drawn out through that. That's straightforward.
We have come to a judgment based on looking at a range of factors. They include that rule of thumb, by and large, if the council is bigger, you'll get bigger efficiencies. But there is a trade-off with existing public sector boundaries, where we also said that we want to try and avoid disruption and map onto existing public sector boundaries. There's probably a trade-off with community engagement. If you had absolutely huge councils, you would lose something there. And by looking at a range of different factors, we've given guidance to try and help the sector. We can try and set that out in more detail if that would be helpful, but there isn't a sort of document that says the right answer is this based on a series of formula, because those formula would be so spurious that they wouldn't have any meaning. It is a judgment.
It falls apart the minute you receive the proposals that aren't entirely in line with assessment that you've tried to make sense of, right? We got to, if we're going to do this genuinely in partnership with local areas where we're going to provide the framework and the guidelines that areas know what they need to be working to, but then say we want to be flexible too and take into account local circumstance, then I think in a way it's self-defeating to tie ourselves to a model that won't last the next couple of months when those proposals come in. I think it's far better that we get the right outcome in terms of the overall number of local authorities, and there will be significantly fewer local authorities at the end of this than at the start of it, mixed with local identity, travel to work areas, and the other points that have been outlined.
Lewis, very quickly.
Yeah, Will, you just said obviously the bigger you are, the more efficient you are. But Birmingham's our biggest one in the country. That's got to be one of the most efficient councils. Councils that we've got. They can't collect the rubbish. They've had loads of issues. They've nearly gone bankrupt a couple of times. Like that, I wouldn't call that a beacon of if you make all these big councils, they're all going to be perfect.
No, but there's a difference between organisational efficiency and efficiencies of scale. They're not the same thing. What we're talking about when we look through the lens of reorganisation is, and it's self-evident, the fewer overhead costs that you have, the fewer same number of multiple posts that you need to have for the same job in multiple local authorities. In reducing the number of local authorities, there is a saving that can be derived from that. It's a more efficient way of delivering that service.
Yeah, also as a rule of thumb. So it is I accept as a generalisation. Without wishing to comment on Birmingham specifically, there may be large councils that have some inefficiencies, but in trying to make policy and trying to sort of steer the most logical way forward, it is just true that there is greater savings for the taxpayer, and as the Minister has set out, the sector as a whole is under substantive pressure. If we can reinvest savings from having fewer councils in frontline services for citizens, then I think we're doing a good thing. So it's a rule of thumb, not a hard and fast rule, as we try and get this balance right.
I'd also be a bit careful and not to get away from significant pressures at Birmingham and other councils. Right. They are self-evident. There is a lot of good work taking place in Birmingham as well, and I'd be a bit careful that we don't return to the way things were in our recent past, where we start parading individual local authorities around for public shaming. There is good and bad in every council. There are more councils with more pressures than others. It's self-evident in the sector, that's what you will get. But there is, in Birmingham, a determination to turn things around and to get the council on the right track. And we're working in partnership on that. So I think in terms of tone, and you can make your own points, and you do that well. But I think we should avoid it if we can.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think just starting to explore the sort of logistics of this in a little bit more detail, there are obviously going to be, in terms of how this now works out, in terms of unitary authorities becoming, joining up together services, how those are impacted are going to be a key part of the consideration. So it'd be really helpful to understand your thoughts on that and how the actual logistics of this will work. And as a committee, we have had representations from others who have voiced some concerns around potential operational risks, particularly around essential services in councils when they go through unitarisation. So it's just really about understanding what the government's plans are to support councils through that process and how we're going to make sure that this is as smooth as possible, because there's obviously going to be a lot of logistical elements to think about as well.
I think that they're all fair points and live conversations about how we support the sector. Some of it will be dependent on the scale of requests that we get in for reorganisation as part of this current statutory invitation process, but there is a recognition that support and capacity will need to be provided. Now, some of that I think is professional capacity from the department, from the LJ and other places, to make sure that councils have the skills for transformation. It will also, though, be in large part dependent on the type of proposals that come forward. So if, for instance, we have a suite of proposals that basically take the boundaries of existing districts and unitaries. Reorganisation on that is reasonably straightforward. You know the workforce, you know the assets, you know the liabilities, you know the debt, you know the reserve levels, etc. Is more straightforward. It becomes a bit more complicated when those aren't the building blocks that are used, and maybe areas want to start from scratch in disaggregating that, and a bit more support will be needed on that. We also know that there are key areas in adult social care, in children's services, and other places, temporary accommodation, where there is a need to keep the show on the road, whatever structural changes are taking place. And there will definitely be support from the sector itself through the LJ and other places, and from the government to make sure that councillors are supported on that.
Just to follow up on that, obviously, this isn't going to be cheap. So in terms of the financial support that is needed to make sure this happens smoothly, what considerations have been given in terms of how that will work?
So we have considered that, and it's correct to say that there will be some upfront investment required to unlock some of that. That may well be capacity more than finance, although the two are related. And it's more about seeing reorganisation as a project in the round. So even if there was investment required up front, that would be realised through a saving later through the efficiencies that will be drawn through reorganisation. And as we said before, there are councils that have been through reorganisation more recently, where they're now realising the cash savings of reorganisation that have gone way and beyond the initial investment that was made.
Just one final question, if I can, Chair. Who has? And as a councillor, as I mentioned earlier, I used to be a councillor in a unitary authority that was only a unitary authority. Only became a unitary authority 23 years ago, Medway. There were huge challenges when unitarisation happened, just around bringing those councils together, the cost implications of that, and services. It isn't a smooth and easy, simple process. So I appreciate what you've said, that the considerations are being given, but what lessons are also being learnt from authorities that have done this in the past, and you know, where there has been best practice, but actually what some of the challenges were. Is there any work being done around that?
Well, I think the sector have done well, particularly the LJ, to provide that. But we also know that the county councils network, the district councils network, are fully engaged on this, understandably. I think there is something to say. There is that kind of lived experience, politically and professionally, through councils that have been through reorganisation in different places, Dorset, Cumbria, and other places, where they have quite different experiences of what reorganisation has for good and for bad, and for somewhere in the middle. And I think having that kind of shared across those lessons are learned, I think, is important. So we'll work with the LJ, District Council Network, County Council Network on that.
Yeah, I just had a follow-up, sort of building on that. There was a mention in the white paper about a local government workforce development group, and I just wondered if you could give a bit more update or detail on where that's up to, and I'm particularly interested in, is that just around the kind of those tiers of local government, or is there, one of the questions I've asked to civil servants before is around, with devolution, obviously there's a lot of skill sets, particularly around policy making, that doesn't necessarily exist in the regions at the moment, that I'm just interested in how we support local areas to really become a lot more upskilled in those areas where they are now going to need to have that talent there locally, which doesn't necessarily exist right now.
So the workforce group that we set up through the department is across government, so it includes representatives from Department for Education, from Health and Social Care, from the LGA and other places. That is still kind of working out its priority areas, but they are fairly self-presenting really. It's adult social care, it's children's services, by and large, where we have a significant crisis in recruitment and retention. Now, I think some of that is structural, and it will be dealt with things like, you know, fair pay agreements and making it a good, rewarding career to be in. But we also need to do far more to develop talent and to retain talent as well. So the workforce group will be looking at that across government and across the sector, and that will begin to look at that. We also have conversations at the newly established Leaders Council. So as part of the kind of wider architecture of the Council of Nations and Regions and the Mayoral Council, we've also introduced a Leaders Council to bring together leaders across party and across the country to kind of really grapple with the big issues of the day. Now, some of that are tricky issues like asylum placements or public service reform, but also workforce recruitment and retention is part of that. I think that's quite different than the challenge that we have in combined authorities, where, to be absolutely clear, there is no desire or intention for those to become kind of big service deliverers or even kind of super county councils. We're very clear on these are strategic authorities that really provide the type of service that you have outlined in terms of policy development, research capacity. And I do think there's more we can do there in terms of secondments, in terms of sharing expertise across the sector. I would say there's quite a lot in the ecosystem, though. If you think about kind of the pan-regional groups like the Midlands Engine, the Northern Powerhouse, the South West and other places, there's quite a lot in the ecosystem more broadly that maybe combined authorities could look to bring in at a more localised level. So I wouldn't underestimate how much is there, but I think government could do more.
Yeah, I mean, we're very conscious that we're setting up new institutions. We want these institutions to last, to change the country, and we're asking a lot of them. So it's really high on our list of priorities. We're looking at how we fund strategic authorities through the local government finance settlement, so you have certainty, so you can recruit staff over a sustained period. At the moment, it's a bit piecemeal and hand to mouth, and it's not a sustainable system for the type of responsibilities we are transferring. So I think the biggest thing we can do is fund them properly and ensure that they can recruit people locally. I think we've faced a bit of a problem where sometimes central government has said, have you got the capacity to do that? And the combined authority has said, not unreasonably, well, you haven't promised me that I've got responsibility to do it, so I'm not going to go and recruit a bunch of people for something I don't have responsibility for. So hopefully the framework that we've done here says this is where responsibility sits. So central government gets the confidence that the combined authorities can go and invest in capacity. And as the Minister says, we're doing quite a lot of interchange and secondments now between government departments and combined authorities. I think that's really good. It's really good training for civil servants as much as anything else. The only other thing I'd add is quite a lot of the time I think we conflate capacity and capability. So I think there's a capacity issue. I'm not convinced there's such a capability. I think capability issues in central government, and we sort of need to sort our own house out as well, if you know what I mean, before we go around saying we haven't got capability, because I'm not sure that's always true. I think it's capacity.
Apologies for that. Just a final question from me. One of the big proposals that you outlined with the devolution is with potential savings. You'll be aware of the PwC report a few years ago, which stated potential savings of 2.5 billion over 5 years. When we had witnesses before the committee a few weeks ago, they were very keen to stress that that figure would be unlikely. Has there been any work carried out by the department to actually look at where and how much any savings will be realised from this?
I mean, I think the PwC report is a good anchor. I think it holds the evidence base that was drawn. I think, though, where it will naturally have limitations is it doesn't take into account the LGR proposals that will come forward. And I think really until we see what areas are proposing and do come into government, it will be very, very hard to make an accurate assessment. Nevertheless, there will be a saving. You know, whatever the range of saving will be, whether it's a lower saving because there are more local authorities at the end of it, or a larger saving because there are fewer local authorities at the end of it, or it'll sit somewhere in the middle, whatever that will be, there will be a saving to some degree. That's only one part of it, though. It's also about making sure that local authorities sit as the first among equals on strategic authorities and play their part on this on the devolution agenda. That's a very important part of it. It's also about simplicity, so that local people know where to go to get things done in their area. The two-tier system doesn't provide that in all cases. And so the savings and efficiency is one part of it, but it's not the only part of it. And I think the PwC report is a good anchor, but until we see the proposals that come forward, it will be very difficult to put a number to it.
When do you plan to evaluate or commission any work to see when the savings, after 2 years, after 3 years, what would be the point?
Well, there'll be a constant review of what savings, partly because local authorities, when they transfer from shadow to their new unitaries, will have to budget in for what budget settlement they have, and there'll be a to and fro with a multi-year settlement as part of that work. But central government will have to take a view on what realistic savings can be borne out from that at the point where we have analysed the proposals that have come forward. So in answer to that, the earliest indication will be sometime after the interim proposals are submitted. The best time after that will be when we've had final proposals that we can really tie down.
And again, something that I've mentioned to you a number of times, Minister, in terms of the upfront costs that areas are facing. When we had the chair of the District Councils Network before us, she said that there are huge upfront costs, and many unitary councils created in recent years have experienced crippling financial problems because of the upfront costs. Again, is that something that your department will be looking at? And will that be counted as part of the overall savings you're hoping areas will achieve?
I think there are different reasons for that. I think there are probably examples of where the upfront costs were probably underestimated. And actually the system change, the workforce change costs, the kind of reform in the estate hadn't been really factored through. I think many councils would say actually they did do that work and they provided as much clarity as they could do, but actually events just overtook them, and demand for adult social care, children's and temporary accommodation or home to transport at the same time meant that actually many budget lines didn't hold over the years that transformation programme was coming into force. So I think there are different reasons for that, but I think whatever, we will be able to get an assessment of a reasonable expectation of one, what is a fair upfront cost to support local authorities with through that transformation, and then secondly, what a reasonable saving at the end of that process will be as part of the wider settlement.
Lewis?
Yeah, and I am concerned that you may be putting too much of a focus on how much money is going to be saved by doing all of this. So pre-2009, I think there were probably billions to save, but lots of councils now, district, county, unitaries and all the rest of it, have loads of joined up services. Some have shared chief executives, some have shared staff, shared delivery services. So that's obviously going to impact the savings, because those savings are already born into their budgets and what have you. And then coupled with that, the unitaries that we've created over the short to medium term over the past couple of years, I've started to set up like delivery arms, committees based on the old district boundaries, things like that. So they're obviously an additional cost. So can we just have some assurances that you're not just going to band around, oh, this is going to save a couple of £billion, and we're local government's going to be awash with money when it goes to unitary? Can we just make sure that we look at all of that? Because I don't believe that it's going to save. There will be a saving, but it's not going to, I don't think, be nowhere near it would have been, because there's so many joined up services within local government.
I mean, I think after the hour then we're in violent agreement that we shouldn't be running towards a figure that doesn't hold in the end, recognising the complexities that you mentioned. I mean, I wouldn't overstate though the significance of shared service models in the system today. I think there are significant savings and efficiencies that can go beyond that. But you're right to say there will be limitations, because actually the last decade has meant, like it or not, councils have had to become more efficient, more lean because of the nature of the settlement. That will be true too, which is why we're trying desperately not to get into a figure that don't hold. But we do acknowledge that there are figures that are out there. But let's see what proposals come forward. From that we'll know how many local authorities will be in existence at the end of the reorganisation process, and that will give us an anchor then to have an assessment of how much is needed up front to support the transition costs, and how much is a reasonable saving that can be borne out the back end in terms of savings on a recurring basis.
And just on that, to follow up on Lewis's point, obviously you'll be aware that many councils have existing debts. If they are then forming part of a unitisation, what's going to happen if one council has substantial debt and they're joining with another council? Who's going to be obliged to take on or take responsibility for that debt?
Well, I mean, we will take in the round in the way that the previous government did through reorganisation, assets and liabilities in the round. But we do understand, and it's fairly self-evident, there are some councils that have debts that are so in excess of their revenue that those are something that will need to be looked at. But the starting point, as was with the previous government, is that will be taken in the round in terms of assets and liabilities of all the local authorities in that area. If we get to a point where that becomes either a financial or moral hazard even, then we'll need to take a view on that. But we're not at that point yet.
Yeah. Well, did you want to come?
Sorry, just on the savings point. I mean, the Minister sort of summed it up on the sort of financial savings. I think the only thing I was going to add was, actually the public service benefits of moving to this model will also help financial sustainability. And we're under no illusion this is going to solve all of the financial problems in local government. We really don't think that. But for example, having housing, social care, rough sleeping and temporary accommodation done by one body does give you the potential to have better public service outcomes for citizens in that place, which in turn can help deal with or can help ameliorate some of the increased costs that councils are facing. It's not silver bullet, won't solve all the problems, but does have the potential to be more cost efficient and deliver better value for money for taxpayers.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think as this goes on, we'll be grateful if you could update the committee, and I'm sure this is a discussion that will continue for many months. Order.